Most people encounter philanthropy only after wealth appears, as if giving were a destination reached once accumulation is complete. Books written by those who have studied wealth across lifetimes tell a more counterintuitive story. Giving does not sit at the end of the wealth journey. It runs through the middle of it, shaping how money is earned, preserved, and ultimately understood. Serious books on philanthropy do not romanticize generosity. They analyze it. They show that giving, when practiced intentionally, changes the architecture of wealth rather than merely redistributing it. Wealth created in isolation behaves differently from wealth created within a web of contribution, trust, and purpose. This difference is subtle early on and decisive later. One of the earliest insights these books offer is that giving reframes the meaning of money. In purely accumulative models, money becomes a scoreboard. Net worth rises and falls with identity. Anxiety follows performance. Philanthropy interrupts this dynamic. When money is regularly directed outward, it stops being a measure of self and becomes a medium of impact. This shift reduces the emotional volatility that often sabotages long-term decision-making. Books on wealth psychology consistently highlight this effect. Individuals who integrate giving early tend to make calmer financial choices. They take fewer ego-driven risks. They are less reactive to short-term fluctuations. Philanthropy, in this sense, acts as a stabilizer. It grounds wealth in values rather than comparison. Another recurring theme is that giving clarifies enough. Many people accumulate endlessly because they never define sufficiency. Philanthropic practice forces this question. How much is required to live well? How much is excess? Where does surplus belong? Books show that those who answer these questions deliberately experience less lifestyle inflation and more strategic clarity. Wealth becomes directional rather than compulsive. These books also dismantle the myth that philanthropy weakens wealth. Poorly designed giving can do that. But thoughtful giving often strengthens wealth systems. Philanthropists develop better judgment about capital allocation. They learn to evaluate impact, governance, and incentives. These skills transfer directly to investing and business decisions. Giving becomes a training ground for discernment. Another powerful insight is that philanthropy expands networks in non-transactional ways. When giving is sincere and consistent, relationships form around shared purpose rather than immediate gain. Books document how many financial celebrities built their most trusted partnerships not in boardrooms, but through joint philanthropic efforts. These relationships proved more resilient because they were not born of extraction. Books also emphasize timing. Giving that begins only after wealth is secure often never begins at all. The threshold keeps moving. In contrast, those who gave proportionally at every stage built a habit that scaled naturally with income. This habit protected generosity from becoming performative or conditional. Another important lesson concerns identity. Wealth without giving often narrows identity to producer and accumulator. Philanthropy widens it to steward. This identity shift changes behavior. Stewards think in decades. They care about durability, not just returns. Books show that this mindset improves both philanthropic outcomes and financial ones. Philanthropy literature also confronts the darker side of giving. Money can distort incentives. It can create dependency, misalignment, or unintended harm. Serious books treat this not as a reason to avoid giving, but as a reason to give better. Strategic philanthropy studies root causes, measures outcomes, and adapts. This rigor mirrors disciplined investing. Another recurring theme is humility. Giving exposes how complex social problems truly are. Wealth alone does not solve them. This realization tempers arrogance. It encourages listening. Philanthropists who internalize this humility often become better leaders and investors because they respect complexity rather than oversimplifying it. Books also highlight that philanthropy reshapes legacy. Wealth passed without values often dissolves. Wealth accompanied by a culture of giving creates continuity. Children raised around purposeful philanthropy learn that money carries responsibility. They inherit not just assets, but a framework for using them wisely. Another subtle but important insight is that philanthropy protects wealth from meaninglessness. Many books document a quiet crisis among the wealthy accumulation outpaces. Satisfaction. Giving restores coherence. It reconnects effort to impact. Wealth becomes a means, again, not an end. Philanthropy also influences risk perception. When individuals allocate a portion of wealth to irreversible good, the remaining capital feels less existential. Fear loosens. Decision-making improves. Books note that this emotional relief often leads to better long-term financial performance, not worse. These books also stress that giving does not require vast wealth. Proportionality matters more than scale. Early-stage giving builds muscles of generosity, evaluation, and restraint. Waiting to give until later delays these skills indefinitely. Another recurring insight concerns reciprocity, not in a transactional sense, but in a systemic one. Communities that circulate resources develop trust. Trust lowers friction. Lower friction increases opportunity. Books show how giving contributes indirectly to economic ecosystems in which wealth creation becomes easier for everyone involved. As readers move deeper into philanthropy literature, the tone shifts. Giving stops being framed as sacrifice and starts being framed as alignment. Money flows toward what matters. Internal conflict decreases. Wealth management becomes simpler because decisions are anchored to purpose. Philanthropy also reframes success metrics. Instead of asking how much has been accumulated, books encourage asking how much has been activated. Idle wealth is potential energy. Giving converts it into kinetic force. This conversion gives wealth narrative and direction. Over time, those who integrate philanthropy early report a paradoxical experience. The more clearly they commit to giving, the less anxious they feel about keeping. The fear of loss diminishes. Wealth feels abundant not because it is infinite, but because it is connected to something beyond the self. And this is where the story begins to narrow. Because once giving is understood, not as a charitable afterthought, but as a structural component of how wealth is created, managed, and experienced, the relationship with money changes fundamentally. Accumulation slows its grip. Purpose sharpens decisions. Wealth stops being hoarded and starts being circulated thoughtfully, strengthening both the giver and the systems they touch, like a force that circulates rather than accumulates. And this is where books on philanthropy become most precise about the relationship between giving and lasting wealth. In the second half of these works, authors move away from the emotional appeal of generosity and toward its structural consequences. They show that philanthropy, when practiced consistently, changes how wealth behaves over time. Money that only flows inward becomes rigid. Money that flows outward in thoughtful ways remains dynamic. This dynamism, the books argue, is what allows wealth to endure across decades rather than peak in a single lifetime. One of the most striking lessons repeated across these books is that giving imposes discipline. When a portion of wealth is intentionally set aside for impact spending decisions, become clearer. Excess reveals itself faster. Waste feels heavier. Philanthropy creates a natural constraint that forces prioritization. This constraint does not shrink wealth, it sharpens it. Wealth holders become better allocators precisely because not all capital is available for self-interest. Another insight emerges around time horizon. Philanthropy trains long-term thinking in a way few other practices do. Social problems do not resolve quarterly. Impact unfolds slowly. Books show that individuals deeply engaged in giving begin to evaluate investments, businesses, and careers through a longer lens. Short-term gains lose appeal when they conflict with long-term values. This alignment quietly improves financial resilience. These books also dismantle the myth of the pure giver. Effective philanthropy is not naive. It is analytical. It asks hard questions about incentives, sustainability, and unintended consequences. The same skills required to build wealth, due diligence, measurement, governance, are required to give it away well. Those who learn to give effectively often become better investors because they sharpen their ability to evaluate real-world outcomes rather than theoretical returns. Another recurring theme is that philanthropy changes power dynamics. Wealth without giving often isolates. Wealth with purpose attracts collaboration. Books document how philanthropic initiatives create environments where trust precedes transaction. These environments become fertile ground for ideas, partnerships, and opportunities that would never emerge from purely commercial relationships. Giving in this sense expands opportunity indirectly. The books also emphasize internal transformation. Many wealth holders describe a quiet anxiety that grows as accumulation accelerates. Fear of loss, fear of judgment, fear of irrelevance. Philanthropy interrupts this spiral. When wealth is actively connected to positive impact, its meaning stabilizes. Identity no longer rises and falls with market fluctuations. This emotional stability protects decision-making during periods of volatility. Another powerful insight concerns legacy. Wealth transferred without a culture of giving often fractures families. Wealth embedded in shared purpose tends to unify them. Books show that families who give together talk differently about money. Conflict decreases, entitlement weakens, responsibility strengthens. Philanthropy becomes a language through which values are transmitted across generations. Importantly, these books reject the idea that giving should wait until enough has been reached. Enough is a moving target. Those who delayed philanthropy often never felt ready. In contrast, those who practiced proportional giving from the beginning built habits that scaled naturally with wealth. Giving became identity, not obligation. As the narrative approaches resolution, a deeper realization appears. Philanthropy does not compete with wealth creation. It complements it by answering a question. Accumulation alone cannot. What is this? For when that question is unanswered, wealth feels fragile no matter how large it becomes. When it is answered, wealth gains direction, and so the lesson settles without drama. The power of giving lies not in generosity alone, but in integration. When philanthropy is woven into how wealth is earned, managed, and measured, money becomes less volatile emotionally and more effective practically. It stops being something to guard endlessly and becomes something to steward wisely. If this reflection resonated with you, pause and ask yourself one simple question. If part of your money were removed from your personal use tomorrow and directed toward something meaningful, would your sense of security collapse or clarify? That answer reveals how tightly wealth is tied to identity. Share what this made you reflect on. And if you want to continue exploring book-driven insights on wealth, purpose, and long-term thinking, subscribe and stay connected. Because wealth reaches its highest form not when it accumulates endlessly, but when it circulates with intention.